Well, good evening, everyone. Glad you're here. I'm Shelley Irwin from WGVU Television and Radio, and Dixie Anderson is home in her jammies. John Jellema is out of the country, so you get Shelley Irwin to be your moderator, and I'm very honored to be here, so thank you. Many of you, obviously, members, please raise your hands. Thank you again for that membership, and guests, thank you for being here. Students, always a pleasure to see the young minds at work as well. So keep studying hard. It'll pay off in the end. Please turn off your beepers and your cell phones and any other paraphernalia, for lack of better terms. And again, thanks to Grand Valley State University, of which I am employed, for their sponsorship tonight. We have an interesting panel tonight. Obviously, the protocol, as you know, we'll be hearing from both of our speakers, and then we'll be asking you to come down to the microphones so that we can engage you. That's what Dixie and her team like to actually make this a big part of, and we promise you will be leaving no later than 7:30. Thanks again for being here. Tonight's targeted cutting-edge policy issue is children's human rights, specifically children between worlds, children's rights in the vanguard of global human rights. Tonight's panelists, please refer to your pamphlet for their extended bios, but obviously let me share their brief summaries. Professor Susan Batinsky, Professor of Law, Michigan State University. Where's your green?
Pardon?
Where's your green?
Oh.
Yes. You're authoring, of course, several texts, one recently, Corporal Punishment of Children, a Human Rights Violation. Scholarship does focus on children's rights under the federal constitution and international human rights law. Member of Phi Beta Kappa, and of course teaches evidence, constitutional law, and international human rights law, and much, much more. Her hobby, she cares for her Australian Shepherd, Ruddy. Ms. Mary Flores, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Child Protective Services. Ms. Flores has served as Director of Refugee Services and, of course, Director of Resettlement with St. Vincent's Catholic Charities in Lansing. We'll ask about that. 25 years professional experience in human services, member of the Department of Civil Rights, Michigan Alliance Against Hate Crimes, Michigan's Human Trafficking Task Force, and the American Red Cross International Services Committee, with expertise in, as you read, displaced, at-risk families and child and refugees, populations vulnerable to human rights violations. Obviously, a key that she is here tonight. Her hobby, she loves to travel, and she's off to Guatemala in August. Each panelist will have 20 minutes to share their expertise. We'll then follow up again with your questions. So may I present Ms. Flores to the microphone.
Thank you very much. If I can get used to the screen. There it is. I don't know this. There it is. Yay. Thank you all for coming. I'm very honored to be here today to talk to you about a number of topics. I'm going to be putting a lot of information out there today, so feel free to expound on anything you need to in the question part. My goal today is to put the idea out there, to get you thinking about the vulnerability of children regarding human rights abuses, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that make children vulnerable, and then real specifically look at cultural implications. I'll talk some about refugee resettlement, who refugees are, Michigan's child abuse law, and then cultural implications. So jumping right into it. I just wanted to kind of outline who refugees are. What does it mean when you say somebody is a refugee? Refugee is actually a legal status. If somebody is in the United States as a refugee, that's their status. So whereas I'm a citizen, people may be residents, a refugee is that's legally what they're called. The only way that a person can get the title of a refugee is through the United Nations. and they have to have fled their country of origin for fear of persecution based on one of those 5 areas. So people that come here, some of you may have heard that people that come from Central America are not refugees in the United States because generally the reason they've come here is for economic reasons. It doesn't fall under one of those 5 areas. So here's what happens. War hits a country, people run, and they run to the next country and then they just stop. Obviously, it's not going to be really good land, so the United Nations may find out about them. They come and they help get their basic needs in place, their food, water, latrines, housing, plastic sheets to make housing or whatever it is that they give them. And then they're going to start looking at, okay, what do we do with these people? The first thing they're going to try to do is help them return home, and very often, obviously, the human rights issues are too great if a country's at war, so very often that's not an option. The second thing they may look at is helping them integrate into the country they've run to, and often that's not an option because it may be a country that doesn't have a real strong infrastructure and can't absorb so many people at once. The third thing that they will look at is resettlement to another country. Now, that sounds like an option, but it's not really much of an option because in truth, less than 1% of the refugees in the world ever get resettled. It's a very minute number of people. In the numbers, well, let's talk about what resettlement is. Resettlement is actually what the word sounds like. You're helping people resettle to another country. And here in the United States, resettlement numbers are set by our president, and they've been at 50,000 for quite some time. So in the world, there are between 12 million and 25 million refugees at any given time. Less than 1% of them are resettled. Here in the United States, the number that are generally allowed in every year, or the ceiling, is 50,000. We have the biggest resettlement program in the world. So you see, there aren't a lot of people that actually get resettlement as an option. So the question is, what happens? Oh, I just wanted to throw out here in Michigan, as of 2005, there have been over 43,000 people accepted through the refugee resettlement program, which that's a lot of people. And to resettle refugees, you have to have the involvement of a community. Grand Rapids has a large resettlement program and has been resettling refugees for a long time. You need to be very proud of that. Lansing and Detroit also have resettlement programs. And that's something really to be proud of because you can't resettle refugees without community involvement. What happens to the refugees that aren't resettled, that can't go back home, that can't integrate into the country that they're in? Warehousing. The refugee camp literally becomes a human warehouse. So you can imagine when you've got people that are already very vulnerable from war and they've run to this other country, there's going to be a lot of children involved that are orphaned, that have lost their parents. So you're going to have lots of vulnerable children that are in the refugee camps. And we're going to talk more about some of the things they're vulnerable to. Refugee children that don't have parents or adults that take care of them are called unaccompanied minors. Here in the United States, there are 10 unaccompanied minor sites that accept children for resettlement. And what happens is they go right into a foster care type program that's very comparable to the regular foster care programs that we have in the United States. Again, the numbers are incredibly small. We'll resettle maybe 500 children tops in the United States a year. So you can imagine the number of children out there that are vulnerable because of war, that don't get resettlement and that are warehoused in these refugee camps. I want to real quickly just look at Michigan law on child abuse. When I currently work for Children's Protective Services, and the big question that parents always have is about spanking. You can't tell me I can't spank my children. In Michigan, you can spank your children. It's not against the law. What is against the law is leaving marks. So you can't leave marks on your children. And I just wanted to throw that out there as the way Michigan addresses child abuse law. All right, now I'm going to kind of shift gears and talk about culture, and then I'm going to bring all of this together and talk about what some of the abuses are that children are vulnerable to. What I want you to notice in these three definitions of culture are those words that are highlighted: shared, acceptable, and learned humanity. Culture is not something you're born knowing. You learn culture. You can have culture of a group that you belong to, a club, say, a university. You can have culture of a country, culture of a family. It's something that you learned, and I think the important thing to know about culture is that it's acceptable. So when you have children that are raised in a particular culture, they're not going to understand the accepted behaviors, the learned humanities within another culture. And so you're going to have a lot of vulnerabilities because of that. The question is, why is culture so important? And culture is really the framework with which we look at the world. It's our framework for understanding the world. If you look at these different pictures, you can picture in your mind the different cultures that they represent, and you can almost imagine the way the people in each of these depictions might behave. You can have an idea of what you think the way they may talk or walk or present themselves, because the clothes are a very good indication of what their culture is. And cultures are such defining factors. I'm going to give you an example of two cultures within the Hispanic cultures. You know, we throw out there that a group may be Hispanic, and so we think, okay, I know what that means. But for example, Guatemalan people are a very humble, quiet. It's a male-dominated culture, very traditional family roles, where the men go out and work all day and come home and expect to be waited on at night, and they are. And the women stay home all day and raise the children. It's mainly a Catholic society. And to actually a culture that's almost the antithesis of the Guatemalan culture is the Cuban culture. Cuban people are very extravagant in their expression, and to me, the best way to illustrate that is their dance. They have these beautiful, extravagant dances, and that really, to me, defines or helps me understand the Cuban culture. And the funny thing about the Cuban culture, or funny thing to me, is it's a female-dominated culture. When you're in a group of Cuban people, you need to make sure the men have a voice, not the women. Whereas in most cultures, especially Hispanic cultures, you have to worry about the women having a voice. So that's an example of how different within a specific culture, Hispanic cultures, how different cultures can be even under that umbrella. So let's take culture and with the whole refugee experience kind of in the back of your mind, and talk about what some of the human rights abuses are that children are vulnerable to. In this particular side, the little girl on the right is from Sierra Leone. She's a child prostitute in the camp that she lives in. Obviously, that wasn't a career choice for this child. Somebody took her and started abusing her in prostitution. The little girl on the left is a Sudanese girl who just had her limb hacked off. So you've got an example of sexual abuses and physical abuses that are common kind of things that will occur when you have countries that where the people are living in poverty, and especially where they're exposed to war. These drawings were just paper and crayon given to some Sudanese lost boys. Draw pictures for me. And this is what their heads are full of. I mean, that is such mental abuse that they must be living with every minute. First of all, they witnessed this. So you've got people being killed by helicopters, by people in helicopters, and you've got people being killed by other people on horseback. I mean, incredibly abusive, terrorizing things to witness, and then you have your head full of that. I mean, these are little kids who are living their lives with their head full of this. I mean, just incredible mental abuse. I just can't imagine having to live with things like that in my head. child soldiers, this is an unbelievable. It's an area that grows every year that when I was younger I had no idea. But when you have countries that are at war, children make such wonderful soldiers for them. They can take these kids and clear minefields. They can take the kids and send them out to draw fire so that they can figure out where the enemy is. The other thing about kids is they don't have the developed sense of morality and values that adults do, or compassion, and so they can be incredibly vicious. So you've got these children that are doing these incredibly vicious, terrible things, and then these particular children are in a rehabilitation camp for kids that were child soldiers. They've got to live with what they did, the vicious acts that they performed. I mean, what unbelievable human rights violations. So you've got children that, as young children, they experience these terrible things, and then they grow up with this kind of stuff in their head. Another, trafficking is a area that grows every year, and what trafficking literally means is slavery. It means human slavery. It sounds, because of, I don't know why that word was chosen, but it sounds like there's some movement involved in trafficking. There isn't necessarily any movement across borders or into any other places involved with trafficking. It's plain and simply slavery, human slavery. And children obviously are particularly vulnerable to this. When you have children that don't have parents, or when you have cultures that don't necessarily value little girls, it's not such an unusual thing for parents to say, you know what, if we send her off with these people that are going to give her a good job, and then they'll send money back to us and we can, buy food, put the other kids in school. Whereas when they think the kids are going off to this wonderful little job being a nanny or something, they're going off to the brothels, which, parents can figure that out. But when you're in a culture where it's not that important what's happening to the little girls, these kind of human rights abuses happen. Trafficking is right up there with the drug trade and the arms trades as a wonderful way to make illicit money. Wonderful meaning if you want to make a lot of money. Another important human rights abuse is street children. In Central America particularly, the street children are just downright considered vermin. In Central America, the way they look at children really is as miniature adults. They don't really look at them as, here in the United States, like if we're having an adult conversation in a room, we may ask the children to leave the room because we just, we know that's not something their little minds should be trying to wrap their brain cells around. They don't look at it that way in Central America. Children aren't considered, they aren't held on a different level like that, like they are here. So when you have children that are living on the streets that steal food to eat, how else are they going to get their food if they don't have an adult that's helping them get food? People get angry. And they get the police, they go to the police, they get angry with the police, they get the police involved, and human rights abuses start as far as killing the street children. And they appreciate that. They appreciate that they're getting rid of the street children. They don't have again, it's a cultural way of looking at who children are. They don't have this concept that we have in the United States that children need to be protected by adults and they can't be expected to make decisions that adults can be expected to make or deal with things that adults can deal with. The other area, or the last area I wanted to put out there that are abuses that children are very vulnerable to are female-based abuses. The first one, and these abuses, I got ahead of myself. Sorry about that. These abuses are very culturally oriented. For example, female genital mutilation. I was incredibly surprised to find it's not the men that perform female genital mutilation, it's the women. For those of you that don't know what it is, it's sometimes called the female circumcision. And there's a lot of different forms that female genital mutilation can take. But the bottom line is there is nothing positive for the female body to have female genital mutilation. It's actually detrimental to a woman's health. There are a lot of problems that come from having this performed on children. But it's not the men that do it. I always assumed it was the men because it was a control thing. It's not at all. You ask women in the cultures that perform it, why do you do this? And they'll say, our ancestors have always done it. We figure it must be something we have to do. Culture is very culturally oriented. You ask the men if they want their women to have this done, and at least half of them will say, no, it causes problems. We don't want them to have this kind of problems. And I just find that incredible. This is purely women perpetuating this act, if you will, that's harmful to themselves. Honor killings, I'm sure you've all heard of cultures where it can be bad for the family name. It can mar the family honor when young women date the wrong person. Maybe they get raped, but somehow they're involved in sex in some way, whether it be of their own volition or not, and to get their honor back, they kill the culprit, and that gets them their honor back. Acid punishments, I know you've all heard of that, when men maybe are jilted by a girl that they've approached and they respond by throwing acid on them. This last one, there was a case, this is a specific case I heard about in Pakistan, where there was a man in the family that they decided in a Sharia court that he had abused a woman in another family, and as a punishment, his sister was ordered gang raped by men in the first family. That was the punishment for the man. Very culturally based kind of things. And certainly here in the United States, all of these are things that we would find horrifying, but in some cultures it's acceptable. So the question when you're considering, well, actually, these are some of the areas that you really need to consider when you're looking at a global standard for children in the area of human rights and abuses. Thank you very much.
Well, first, I would like to thank you for having me here. This program is titled Between Two Worlds, Human Rights in the 21st Century. But I would ask you this, are we really poised between two worlds? After the blood-soaked violence of the 20th century and its predecessors, are we in fact transitioning to something more civilized in the 21st? The bad news is that the first 8 years of this century do not seem to be much of an improvement. Witness the continuing U.S. war in Iraq, U.S. abuse of the prisoners at Abu Ghraib, the terrorist attack in Mumbai, widespread rape as a tool of war in the Congo, the Georgia-Russia set-to, and the interminable and tragic flare-ups in the Middle East, including the recent creation of a grave humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And as we all know, this is by no means an exhaustive list of the incidents involving armed force and disregard for human dignity since the turn of the millennium. So you're thinking, where is the good news? What good news? There is good news, but it is not of the lurid, if it bleeds, it leads type, which dominates the American news media. Subtle, non-lurid changes are afoot, which I would suggest, if they persist, have monumental ramifications for the development of a more reliable global peace, where observance of human rights will be priority number one. Broadly speaking, one can point to an ever-proliferating number of international human rights laws and their increasingly powerful influence on the behavior of nations. The election of President Obama and his prompt order to close Guantanamo are symptomatic of this dynamic, as is the ongoing flap over whether to prosecute certain Bush administration officials for authorizing torture. Imagine there being such a flap in the 13th century over the torture carried out by the Spanish Inquisition. We are making some progress. However, I would like to focus today on what I regard as the single most important human right, the mother of all human rights, if you will. I refer to the child's right to be free of all corporal punishment. Let me be clear as to what this right is and what it is not, where it comes from, and why it is a very, very good thing that it exists. Then I will explain why it is indeed the mother of all human rights and the bearing that has on our century. International law guarantees the child's right to governmental protection against all corporal punishment, regardless of who administers it, how mild or severe it is, or where it is administered. It is an absolute right and allows for no exceptions whatsoever. The right is implicitly guaranteed in at least 5 human rights treaties. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is a major treaty where the right is found, and I would just like to interject a piece of information that I think we should all be aware of. Do you know that all of the countries of the world have ratified the Children's Convention except the United States of America and Somalia? Somalia has an excuse. It has no internationally recognized government. So what are the other treaties that guarantee this child's right to be free of all corporal punishment? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the UN Convention Against Torture and Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and the European Social Charters. The clearest articulation is perhaps set forth in Article 19 of the Children's Convention, which requires states parties to shield the child from, quote, all forms of physical violence, close quote. The U.S., while not a party to the Children's Convention, is, you should know, a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Torture Convention. Incidentally, it may interest and even shock you to learn that 23 nations, in conformance with these treaty obligations, have enacted or adjudicated total bans on all corporal punishment of children within their countries. The abolitionist countries are Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and I'm suspecting maybe you're thinking, oh, those Scandinavian countries, well, duh. But how about this? Cyprus, Austria, Germany, Iceland, Latvia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, Spain, Venezuela, Uruguay, Portugal, Hungary, Greece, Israel, Costa Rica, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. Over 100 nations have banned the practice in the schools. In contrast, in the United States, So-called reasonable parental corporal punishment of children is allowed in all 50 states. School corporal punishment, however, is now illegal in 28 states, including Michigan. And even within the remaining 22 states, the major metropolitan school districts have also instituted bans. It is fair to ask what the phrase corporal punishment of children actually encompasses. What is this practice against which international law and an exponentially increasing number of countries have so staunchly set themselves? The definition of corporal punishment of children is this: the use of physical force upon a child's body with the intention of causing the child to experience bodily pain so as to correct or punish the child's behavior. Two things should be remarked about this definition. First, it encompasses garden variety, so-called reasonable spankings, including when a parent in a fit of frustration, and believe me, I've been there, I have a son, fit of frustration, I've managed to restrain myself, but I know that there are parents who will give a small hit to a toddler's diapered bottom, right? And you're thinking, oh, come on, a human rights violation? Yes. This falls within the definition of corporal punishment. This, too, is considered a violation of the human rights treaties I just mentioned. Second, the second thing I would like you to observe about this definition of corporal punishment of children is that the definition does exclude physical restraint of children to prevent them from imminently injuring themselves, other people, or damaging property. But why has the international community classified the punishment as a human rights violation? And why do I go even further by designating it as the mother of all human rights? Let me now address these issues. Basically, international lawmakers have reacted to the growing realization that corporal punishment of children is morally wrong due to four aspects of the punishment. First, by definition, this sort of punishment inflicts bodily pain upon the child. Pain, it turns out, which is actually completely unnecessary. It is unnecessary because scientific studies now show that corporal punishment is correlated, perversely, with impeding the child's development of a conscience. Of course, the main goal of child discipline is precisely to grow the child's conscience. And there are many more effective and nonviolent disciplinary tools easily at adults' disposal, such as timeout, reasoning, letting the child take the consequences within reason of his or her naughtiness, grounding, other deprivations of privileges, and so on. By the way, neither I nor international human rights law are advocating permissiveness in child rearing. Second, corporal punishment of children is simply unfair if you compare children who live in countries where it is still legal with adults in those countries. That is, corporal punishment of children has all of the elements constituting the crime of assault and battery. But in such countries, it is only the adults who have recourse against assault and battery. Yet children are usually smaller and more vulnerable than adults, and children are typically utterly dependent upon adults. If anyone deserves legal recourse, it should, at a minimum, be children. Third, corporal punishment may cause a great deal of harm to children, even beyond infliction of bodily pain. Scientific studies now demonstrate that this type of punishment is correlated with at least 10 adverse outcomes for the child. They are increased child aggression, decreased child cognitive development, increased child delinquent and antisocial conduct, decreased quality of the parent-child relationship, decreased child mental health, and increased risk of undergoing classical physical child abuse. And, I'm not done, upon reaching adulthood, increased adult aggression, increased adult criminal and antisocial behavior, decreased adult mental health, and increased risk of abusing one's own children or spouse. The practice is associated with only one arguably desirable outcome, increased immediate child compliance, but the compliance is always short-lived. It should be emphasized that not every child who is corporally punished will suffer these negative outcomes. Undoubtedly, some will emerge from the experience unscathed. The difficulty is that we do not know which or how many children will be psychologically scarred. Thus, the only humane and responsible thing to do is to ban the punishment in relation to all children. This is actually the same approach taken by doctors and lawmakers to the issue of smoking cigarettes. Even though not all smokers will come down with lung cancer or heart disease, some will. And that is enough for doctors to urge patients not to light up and for legislators to pass anti-smoking ordinances. The fourth ethical objection to corporal punishment of children stems from the fact, previously mentioned, that some of corporal punishment's adverse effects on children may persist into adulthood. For persons so afflicted on a long-term or even lifetime basis, that is obviously an individual tragedy, and no minor thing at that. But consider this. If, as is certain to happen, some corporally punished children grow up to be more aggressive than the average bear, more likely to engage in criminal and antisocial conduct than the average bear, and less likely to enjoy mental health than the average bear, then what does that mean for the societies such people inhabit? It does not require rocket science to conclude that if there are more adults in a given society who have such traits, that society will consequently be plagued by more violent interactions born of these traits. Indeed, what kind of person is it who has the fury and the stomach to perpetrate human rights violations, especially violent ones like torture, or to initiate unjustifiable wars? Although there may be exceptions, such a person must, as a rule, be aggressive and antisocial and criminally inclined. And a dollop of mental illness would probably make his or her aptitude for violence and atrocity all the stronger. Even if possessing these attributes does not lead to perpetration, consider it may lead to advocating or turning a blind eye toward violent human rights transgressions and aggressive wars. One has to wonder, for example, if Dick Cheney was spanked as a little boy. I'm betting he was. This is why the child's right to be safeguarded from corporal punishment is the mother of all human rights. The more this right is implemented and internalized, the fewer human rights violators and warmongers will be created, and the fewer citizens there will be who will tolerate this sort of thing from the sidelines. Now, naturally, corporal punishment of children is not the sole reason why humankind's march through the millennia has been drenched in blood and gore. There generally have been complex political, economic, and social dynamics also underlying the mayhem. That does not, however, minimize the major role corporal punishment seems to have been playing to our awful detriment. It is telling that in a world ever wrenched by human violence, a virtually worldwide practice, spanking, produces the necessary psychology for committing this carnage, and, like the carnage, has been with us from the get-go: corporal punishment of children. Now, if you think about it, this is not as depressing as it might sound. There's a real upside in our increasing understanding of corporal punishment's role that bodes well for a more peaceful and lawful future. The advent of international human rights laws condemning all corporal punishment of children is, from a historical perspective, a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only about 19 years old. This means that we really don't know what the world would be like if populated almost entirely by people who have not undergone corporal punishment during childhood. Given what we do know about the effects of this kind of discipline, we might find that abolition eventually leads to a much more peaceful planet, one in which the incidence of human rights trespasses and bellicosity is hugely diminished. The point is that the appearance on the scene of this new international human right enlightens us that we have the power, literally within our very hands, to immediately begin the process of fashioning a gentler world for the 21st century, as well as making childhood a more joyful experience. Indeed, not only does human rights law so empower us, but it actually makes it our legal duty to undertake personal responsibility for assuring that this process spreads and goes forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As our panelists take their seats, I'd like to offer you each an opportunity as we wait for you to come down to your microphones. One is here and one is over here. Ms. Flores, any questions you have for Professor Batinsky?
I do, thank you. I'm wondering, you listed a number of countries that have ratified the treaties that against corporal punishment. Have any of them taken any action against people that's successful in them that do corporal punishment?
Okay, first of all the countries of the world except the U.S. and Somalia have ratified the Children's Convention. Most of them are parties to the other treaties I mentioned. As I indicated, 23 countries have now, as a matter of their national laws, they've enacted statutes or they have Supreme Court decisions banning all corporal punishment within the individual country. Now, what happens if, for example, a parent corporally punishes their child and this comes to the attention of the authorities? With respect to parental corporal punishment, if it is mild or so-called reasonable, then the government will not prosecute. Technically, theoretically, in all of these countries, it is possible for an offending adult, be they a parent, a teacher, whatever, to be prosecuted for assault and battery or child abuse. However, when it is a parent or a grandparent who is the perpetrator, the offender, these countries exercise strict prosecutorial restraint. The idea being, you might then say, well, geez, this is pretty hypocritical. They have a law on the books banning it, and then they don't take anybody to task for it. But what these countries do is they rely upon the pedagogical value of the bans, of these laws, to, over time, slowly create a mindset in the people to make corporal punishment of children socially unacceptable. The country that has had such a statute the longest is Sweden. They've had it since 1979. And so there have been quite a few studies of the effect of the statute in Sweden. And indeed, it is changing attitudes so that people are against this practice and do not engage in it very much. Since 1979, there have been 5 prosecutions of parents for less than severe corporal punishment. Let me just add that, of course, severe or strong corporal punishment is prosecuted, just as it is in our country as child abuse.
Thank you.
Professor Butzinski, any questions for Ms. Boyce?
Yeah, actually, I do. You mentioned that in Michigan, corporal punishment by parents is legal as long as the punishment leaves no marks on the child's body. And I was wondering if that is also legally true of foster parents.
Oh, yes, it's not.
It's not
at all. Yeah, foster parents have to agree to not use any kind of corporal punishment. It's a good point.
Any questions? We're bringing questions to a person. I just have a follow-up while we're waiting for that for you, Mary. What are our responsibilities if we're in a grocery store and we see a significant spanking happening? Do we have a responsibility as a community person?
In Michigan, there are mandated reporters, and mandated reporters are people that work specifically with children, and like medical personnel, social workers, school personnel. So a general citizen out in the public is not a mandated reporter, but I think you do have a responsibility that's just a simple responsibility as a citizen in your community. And if you feel like something that you're witnessing is just too much or could qualify as child abuse, that's what the Children Protective Services workers are for. So if you call it in, they'll do an investigation. And incidentally, 60% of the allegations or referrals that are made to Children's Protective Services are actual denials. So, I mean, that's our job to figure out if it is something that needs to be looked at or not. So you should, anytime you have a question, call it in.
Professor, follow up on it?
Yeah, I think for the unmandated reporters or unmandated citizens, my attitude is, well, first of all, I do intervene even if I see what we as Americans would consider sub-abuse hitting. I think all hitting is abuse, but I'm very careful about the way I intervene because, after all, if it is a parent, they feel that an interloper has no business interfering, and they're very liable to get defensive and even angrier. So my form of intervention is to try to help the parent by diverting the child. Try to get the child to stop crying or screaming. And just the presence of another person there usually makes the parent tone down whatever they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Question in the back.
Yeah, Stan. Well, I actually have a question for Professor Butzinski. Is that right?
Yes.
You mentioned that there were 23 nations that enacted total bans. Just some that I had written down include the Scandinavian, Austria, Germany, Romania, Portugal, Israel, Netherlands, Ukraine. Do those countries still have issues with child abuse and neglect? I mean, from what we see on the news every day, we still have huge problems with child abuse in terms of pedophilia around the world. So I'm wondering how effective these quote-unquote total bans are if we're just going to allow this international law that some people may or may not know about eventually lead to this accepted, oh, we can't do this anymore. I think that's a little wishful thinking, that that that's going to take place. And to not actually enforce it, I think is, it seems it just doesn't seem right to me. So I don't know if that's a question or not. But
sure it is. Well, first of all, you shouldn't judge populations' knowledge of international human rights law by us here in the United States. Because in other countries, actually children in school, in elementary school, are taught about international human rights laws. And certainly people going up through the high schools and into college, this is something they all learn about. Unfortunately, it is not generally part of curriculum in American schools or even in higher education. So that's one thing. Secondly, I understand your concern that this is hypocritical. What does this do if we have these bans and we are not enforcing them? It is a mistake to think of the operation of law as something that is immediate. I think the layperson, and actually even a lot of lawyers, tend to think of law as having its effect by boom, you're incarcerated, boom, you're fined. And so we all shake in our boots and are compliant because of this kind of immediate reaction. But the fact is that actually most law is effective through a process of absorption over time. The greatest teacher in the world is, I would say, not a professor, not at the university, but it's actually at the state capitol in East Lansing or in Washington, D.C. That is, it is the laws of our country that are our best teachers. Why? Because first of all, these laws tend to be very concise in conveying a moral message. Don't spank, don't murder, don't burglarize. But secondly, they have the imprimatur of the state, these pedagogical lessons, these pedagogical messages. And that makes them a very powerful teacher. As I said, in Sweden, the results are in now. That country has been studied to death. And its ban on corporal punishment has been studied to death. It has altered attitudes significantly against corporal punishment of children. It has reduced the incidence of corporal punishment of children. So, we have the science of how these bans seem to be operating. Even though, just 1 minute, Germany's ban is relatively recent. There has been a study in Germany, and already we're starting to see the same effect there. Now, are these bans on corporal punishment of children, are they going to eliminate all child abuse, pedophilia, all that ails childhood in the world presently? Well, no, of course not. They're not a panacea. But in Sweden, they have found actually that the bans on spanking do seem to be also reducing the incidence of more severe child abuse. And in fact, scientific studies show that spanking is correlated with the child's risk of undergoing more severe child abuse. So,
another question.
Hi. You speak of this decreasing child abuse and more severe child abuse, but has there been a correlation to decreasing crime in general?
I don't know that. However, one interesting statistic is that studies that have been done in the United States show that incarcerated people who have been convicted of violent crimes always have corporal punishment in their childhood backgrounds.
Ms. Flores, did you, I have a record that Quake orphans have been adopted for jihad. Orphans over in, that have earthquakes over in that area, that they actually were adopted for jihad training?
I heard Quaker.
I'm sorry.
And yeah.
Earthquake, yeah. Oops. Earthquake victims, that the actual children will be taken and adopted for jihad.
You know, I hadn't heard about that, but it makes sense. I mean, what the people, soldiers, are looking for are vulnerable children, and after earthquakes, you have so many children that are lost that, yeah, it could be.
Any questions? Yes, back here.
My question's for Ms. Florence. I wondered first in your presentation whether you think it's fair to boil down, say, the Cuban culture to a picture of a dance, or whether that might be ethnic stereotyping. And I further wonder, you seem to mention that Central American countries, they don't seem to mind killing children, or they certainly don't seem to see children as humans. And I wondered personally from experience, my 7th grade Spanish teacher was from Nicaragua, and she didn't seem to exhibit those sorts of behaviors or values. So I wondered if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that that's what you pulled from those slides. I mean, of course there's a lot more to the Cuban culture than just dance. When I think of the Cuban culture, I think of the dance, and that's why I use that example. But of course there is much more. I mean, I love Cuban dancing, but there's much more to the culture. You're right, and I didn't intend to give the impression that I was explaining the entire culture in one slide. As far as the Central American people enjoying killing children, know that I apologize, that's what you heard from the slide. I was specifically talking about street children, and I was specifically talking about the police in Central American countries. And there are a lot of human rights abuses that have been attributed to police in Central American countries against street children, particularly death. But I did not in any way mean to imply that Central American people enjoyed killing children. As a matter of fact, I take my children to Central America a lot. So I wouldn't do that if I thought that was their pastime.
Yes.
Yeah, I also just would like to interject something in response to your question, and that is I'd like to reemphasize that a number of the countries that I listed in the vanguard of banning corporal punishment of children are South American countries, and all of them have ratified the Children's Convention as well. So it's certainly, I think, a very complex situation down there, but it's a complex situation here too. I think it's complex everywhere.
Yes, back in the back here.
I'll speak really loud. Do you think that there's a prospect for President Obama to increase the cap for refugees that are allowed into the United States? And do we have the infrastructure to accept more refugees if that were to occur?
The question is if Obama might increase the cap to the numbers of refugees allowed in the U.S. I would say no, and to that, and also no to do we have the infrastructure to be able to assist them. You know, refugee resettlement is a really controversial practice, and I think the reason why it is so controversial is because if you have a group of people that have run from their country as refugees, and you ask them, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to this country where they don't speak your language, where their culture is entirely, completely different from yours, where you have very little transferable knowledge to help you be successful in that country, or do you want to go home? You know, they're always going to say they want to go home. So resettlement isn't, and always is a strong word, they may not always, but generally they're going to want to go home. So resettlement isn't always the best option, but it's one of the only options. I think that's the key. So the reason I think that Obama would not raise the numbers of refugees that are allowed in the U.S. is because it is very controversial, not only from the refugee standpoint, is that the best option for them personally, but also here in the United States, I know that anytime refugees come up, probably at least half of you it crossed your mind, why are we bringing refugees here? We have so many people here that need help already. Why would we bring more? And that's a discussion that needs to be had because it's a question that people have. Refugees bring a lot into communities, as again people here in Grand Rapids know because there are so many refugees that have been resettled in Grand Rapids. They're the people that know how to survive. They're the people that have incredible hope that they bring with them because they've been through such horrible things and they still have a hope for a future. They often bring children with them to our state that is losing all its people to the last one turn out the lights kind of thing. So there's a lot of benefits to refugee resettlement, and that's an important conversation, but I don't think that any president would just raise the numbers.
We have a question over here?
Maybe I missed it, I don't know, but let's say that there are Somalian refugees, and refugees is a legal status. What happens if there are a bunch of little children in a warehouse or a refugee camp? And are there any safeguards, protections for keeping the children from being taken and put into prostitution by, let's say, Chad rebels or something like that? I mean, can the United Nations peacekeeping forces that are there, or is there any kind of safeguard for the people that are in these camps?
You know, each camp is going to build its own policing force, if you will. So the people that live in that camp are going to they're going to have cultural standards, and they're going to watch their children, or you know, they'll set their rules and laws. But having said that, you're talking about people that are under incredible stress. They've just run from war. They're in a place where they're barely getting their needs met. And so there's going to be a lot of children that are going to very easily fall through the cracks. So I think that in general the answer to your question is no, it's not like the UNHCR comes in and polices the camps, but within the camps they'll set up their own policing. I know in some countries it's so despised that the refugees are even there because the people that live around them don't want that camp to be there, that it's dangerous for the refugees to even leave the camp. I'm talking about even just general citizens. I'm telling you, one of the most moving things that I ever witnessed, I was working with a group of Liberian women. There were about 8 of them, and they were going to do a little skit at an International Red Cross Services Forum that we do annually in Lansing. And so I was helping them put the skit together, and I tell you, these Liberian women are the best actresses. They were just incredible. They were so much fun to watch. But they said, okay, they wanted to do a skit to show people what it was like to live in the refugee camp. I said, okay, what would you like to do? They said, you know what, we want to let's start out with what we had to go through to leave the camp. And the thing is, you had to leave the camp. The camp this was in Ivory Coast, and it had a fence around it. It was shut in. But you had to leave the camp to go get food. There weren't like gardens and things like that in the camp. And so you'd have to go down this long, dusty road to the nearest town to get food. Or they even told me if one of their children died, they'd have to leave the camp to go bury their child. So they said, you be the policeman, Mary. You just stand there, and you be the policeman. And I said, okay, so I stood up and I said, okay, now show me what'll happen. And those women, every one of them, they just threw themselves at my feet and started begging me to give them back their identification cards, because generally, or very often, the police would just take them and tear them up. And they started just begging me. And I realized I had worked with Liberian people for a while, and I couldn't quite understand them. But I realized these people that had lived in these refugee camps, at least in Ivory Coast, had spent their lives begging for anything and everything that they wanted or needed. And it was such an incredible experience. So there are dangers just outside the gates, because they're in a country that doesn't want them, and the local people very often don't want them.
I'm going to go to Michael and then to you. Michael Hanson.
I don't have a microphone. I have a brother who's also a professor at Nebraska and was hired in his role by the State Department as well as the United Nations to do a very long-term study on human trafficking.
Oh.
So you brought the subject up. They turned the report in last year to the United Nations and to the United States State Department. The estimates that they have are fairly rough, because you don't go around the world counting who's been brought into a country on false pretenses of saying you'll be a CPA just like you are in your home country and come over and become a prostitute in this country. So, but the number was about 10 million people in the world each year are victims of human trafficking. So I don't know what kind of studies as it relates to the children as an aspect of it, and I didn't know what kind of insights that the two of you might have in terms of that. And every country seems to be victimized as well as perpetrators of the use of human trafficking. So I didn't know if you could address that a little bit more.
You know, I'd be really interested to find out where I could get my
head. The study hasn't
head.
been published, and a lot of the techniques and the processes that were used were of great confidence in terms of, because it's extremely. I mean, I was worried about it.
Yeah,
He travels all over the world, and I thought, well, this is a dangerous job you got. So, but eventually, this information is being used by certain divisions of the United Nations in conjunction with the State Department.
Wow.
But I didn't know what additional information that you might share in terms of human trafficking as we witness it and what we see. There's not much information in the United States, even on the media and the news, in regards to this
Right.
stuff. It goes on all the time.
There actually is a protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child against trafficking in children. As well as Hague conventions that deal with it. So there's treaty law in place.
Have you heard of Free the Slaves and Kevin Bales, who is the founder of Free the Slaves, and Martha Fajuda, who's involved with this program, is actually a representative of Free the Slaves. But Kevin Bales wrote a book that you can get if you Google Free the Slaves. You can get over the internet, called Disposable People. And it's an incredible study. I think it was pretty much the first specific study on trafficked people. And what he did is he went to 5 countries where slavery had literally been institutionalized. And he studied it, those 5 countries, and it just is an unbelievably well written done. It's an incredibly done study. He looked at the sociological factors, the cultural factors, the political factors, everything involved. And the one thing that I was very fascinated with that he said had to be present in a country for slavery to become institutionalized is it had to be a patriarchal society. It's Disposable People. The author is Kevin Bales, and he founded Free the Slaves. He's a professor at a university, Oxford maybe. I should know where, but.
Thanks for your patience.
My question is particularly to you, Ms. Flores. As somebody who works in the Child Protective Services, if a ban was to be taken on by the United States against corporal punishment with children. Do you feel like the United States could adequately handle that at this point, especially in states like Michigan, which have just changed all of their laws, requiring much more rigorous, requirements on DHS, CPS, everybody involved in the system?
Are you talking about the lawsuit that came out of the New York finding recently? Is that what you're referring to when you said the laws were recently changed? You know, the thing about child abuse and neglect laws in Michigan, and I suppose any state in the United States, is that they're constantly changing. They're set by legislators. And I think your question was, could it adequately be addressed?
Yeah, I think you can hear me about it. With the amount of people, like the amount of cases that they have now, I guess if a ban were to take place, I would assume that there would be more calls and more action that would need to be at least taken initially, which would be done by people like CPS and DHS. And so in these states that don't have enough workers as it is and are struggling to try and find enough workers, would an actual ban even be able to be handled? Particularly like right away, not tomorrow, but relatively soon.
You know, I work in Ingham County, and being the capital seat of Michigan, you're always going to have a greater spotlight in the counties that are in the capital. And I really love being there because we're held to the fire even closer. And you know, you mentioned that there usually are not enough workers, and it's social work. There's never enough workers. You're totally right. And so, can you adequately really look at each case? You know, truthfully, I don't think it'd make a terrible difference on how we did our job, because the difference that it would make is we would substantiate on more cases. So I think it is something that could be manageable. I really do. I don't think it would cause. Maybe there would be more calls to CPS, but maybe not. Maybe people look at, if they see somebody hitting a child, they may react the same whether or not that ban is in place. Do you know what I mean? They may think, oh, that's something someone ought to look at. So we would probably have more substantiations, because right now you have to have a mark to substantiate. But I think it could be done.
Thank you. Final questions? Yes?
Can you tell me what the reasons or arguments are as to why our country hasn't ratified the treaty?
Yeah. Oh. No, I agree. That's a good question.
Well, first of all, let me just say that as a general matter, even though our various successive governments, the national government, has, each administration talks about human rights in China and how we champion human rights, and isn't it awful what they're doing in, Burma. In the meantime, our own record on ratifying human rights treaties is abysmal. We have really just dragged our feet. And just to give you an idea, in 1966, the two international covenants, these UN covenants on human rights, were promulgated. Most of the rest of the world ratified them. We finally did ratify one of them in 1994. Now, with respect to, so we tend to drag our feet generally. And I think part of that comes from I'm not entirely sure. I don't have all the answers. I do think that there is a kind of paranoia among some of our government officials about international scrutiny of what goes on in the United States. And when a country does become a party to a treaty, you are subjected to international reports on whether you're complying with the treaty. With respect to the Children's Convention, the United States was actually very active in helping to draft that convention. We were a leader in drafting it. Many of the provisions in it are a result of the U.S. representative's insistence. However, I think that there is concern that it would be too invasive of the privacy of the family in certain instances. For example, with respect to the corporal punishment issue, and there are other issues like that as well. Even though the Children's Convention is actually very parent-friendly and very family-friendly and is intended to try to respect the parent's role and to help the parent. But that's my best guess.
One last question up here, please.
I have a very short question for you.
I'm wondering, corporal punishment, which is very serious, but other kinds of abuse, verbal abuse and other kinds of abuse of children, and is that addressed in any of these things along with what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, these treaties do address it because they also forbid degrading punishment. And the statutes of the countries that have banned corporal punishment of children, they vary greatly. But for example, Sweden's also forbids treating the child in a way, punishing the child in a way that undercuts his or her dignity. So there actually are, some of these statutes are very broadly drawn. And I don't mean to suggest, in talking only about corporal punishment, that there aren't other deleterious ways of punishing children. There are. Verbal abuse can be very deleterious.
Final question back.
I have a really short question for you. In the eyes of the UN, who exactly is considered to be a child?
It's under the Children's Convention. It is between birth and age 18.
Round of applause to your panelists, please.